That was when I learned that words are no good, that words never even fit what they're trying to say yet. You find yourself in a similar position to Addie Bunger now, looking back at the span of a life from its death. But it's not your own life you look back on, nor do you look back on it from your own death. No, it's your dad's life you look back upon from his death. He's dead, and now you have to say some words about his life, but words are no good. They never fit what they're trying to say at. As you try to fit your words to your dad, like fitting square pegs in round holes, you understand what Addie meant by words just being the gaps in people's lacks, coming down like the cries of the geese out of the wild darkness in the old terrible nights, fumbling at the deeds like the orphans to whom are pointed out in a crowd two-faced and told, "That is your father. That is your father. That is your father." These words are not your father, but that is a problem because that's all that's left of him. Words that'll become stories, that'll become laughter, that'll become tears among family. Well, there's something besides stories left of your dad. There are pictures of him. Videos, too.
I remember when we flushed the toilet and the toilet paper went.
It is strange for someone to have presence with no present, only a past you gaze back upon like Orpheus upon Eurydice. One last look you'll hold on to forever. It is stranger still because there you are alongside him, a past you that possesses what present you pines for. The subtle, familiar memory of what it's like to know you're in the other room. That want was articulated by Phil Elverum, as it was a want he had for his wife who passed away. He too reflected on the pictures he had of her, pictures of the past which reminded him of the present loss. Today I felt it for the first time. 3 months and 1 day after you died, I realized that these photographs we have of you are slowly replacing the subtle, familiar memory of what it's like to know you're in the other room. But those are just more words filling the absence your dad left behind. Not these or any other words can ever fill that absence, that lack he left behind in the place he once inhabited. For the last few months of his life, that was the living room. The cancer spread through his head, but the body followed the example, like the church body follows the head of Christ. That head on his hospital bed laid down one day for the last time, where it wouldn't lift itself for some weeks until someone else came and lifted it out of the house for him. Until then, your dad remained constant, comforting in an odd way, just to know he was there. He had been there yesterday, he remains there today, and he will stay there through tomorrow. But one day tomorrow came and he wasn't there anymore, replaced by the emptiness that remains where he once was, when he once was. Daddy will now always be in the past tense for you. Daddy was an incredibly funny guy. Daddy was a constantly kind man. Daddy was a tremendously great dad. There's no present tense for Daddy because he is not present. He is past, passed away. Addie Bundren has also passed, and in the present the Bundren bunch deal with that passing. Vardaman, Addie's youngest, asks his brother Darrell about their mother. "Then what is your ma, Darrell?" I said. "I haven't got one," Darrell said, "because if I had one, it was, and if it was, it can't be is, can it?" Vardaman asks Darrell what his mother is, and Darrell replies that she is not. She was. Darrell's cleverness is a clear cruelty to his young brother, but what it articulates is true. Addie Bundren is not is. She was is, but now she is was. That is to say, Addie Bundren can never be said to be in the present tense. One cannot say Addie Bundren is a mother, or Addie Bundren is a wife. One can only say Addie Bundren was a mother, Addie Bundren was a wife. Darrell's mother is not present. She is past. She is gone because she was here. Addie Bundren was in the present tense, but now she is in the past tense. This is why Elverum laments the photographs, because it is they that show the past person exists only in the past, only exist in memories. Daddy exists to you in the past tense, as he once existed in the present. He exists in stories, in pictures, in remembrance. Now, of course, he once simultaneously existed both in past and present tense. We all have a past we look back on from the present. You had a lot of fun looking back on your dad's past with him present, as he had a colorful past. Like that time in Chingatere when he peed on the side of the road.
Daddy's peeing house.
I already got it.
Road.
I want to see.
You'd recall that story to him to tease him and to share a laugh with the rest of your family who sat on the side of that road with him. Then, you were recalling the past to someone who was present. But one day a doctor told you your dad will be was, and then that day came and now your dad is was, for he is no longer. 2 nights before your dad passed, you read this in Lucy Ellman's novel Ducks, Newburyport. The fact that the memory of her won't really die out until Phoebe, Ethan, and I have passed away and stopped thinking about her. But she's dead to herself, so what good are our memories? The fact that memories aren't half as good as Mommy's. You saw your dad become dead to himself. The narrator's mommy passed away from cancer just like your daddy. His was brain cancer. You wondered what all these memories could mean as you watched them fall from his withering grasp. What does it mean for you to remember when your dad was, when he can barely remember that he is? That was when you realized that having memories isn't nearly as good as making them, because memories aren't half as good as daddy's. But it isn't just your own memories, your own words you're left with in daddy's absence. He left behind some words of his own, like his body left behind an impression in the hospital bed. Daddy kept a personal blog for a while following his diagnosis. He called the blog Life, 1 day at a time, and in it he built up the story of his life 1 word at a time, like bricks upon bricks, leaving you now with a house that is admittedly still under construction, as your dad, by the circumstances of his condition, could never see the completion of his life story, could never see the completion of his house. But you have seen that completion, and so you finished the work your dad started, the work of trying to find the words that fit himself and his experience. These were the ones he found to be the best fits. I see one benefit to this already. Already is 3 days after his diagnosis. I see one benefit to this already. None of us are promised 1 second on this earth, and we waste so much time on things that don't matter. I have been lucky enough to be reminded of this and still have the opportunity to make what time I have count, and I will do that with every ounce of my body. One of your dad's favorite movies was Pixar's Up. It's a movie about an old man named Carl Fredricksen who loses the love of his life, Ellie. And that loss is really 2 losses, the loss of the person and the loss of the dream she had to go to Paradise Falls. With Ellie dead, the idea that she can ever go to Paradise Falls is absurd, so it seems the dream died with her. There's just one problem. Carl gave his word to Ellie that he would take her there. He promised her he would take her to Paradise Falls, and he wasn't about to let death part him from that promise. So what is he to do? In As I Lay Dying, Addie's death hits some members of the family harder than others. Dewey, Dale, and Ants are so caught up in their own wants, an abortion for the former and teeth for the latter, that neither really give Addie much thought beyond getting her to her grave, with Ants even replacing Addie right after burying her, resulting in the novel's final words, "Meet Mrs. Bundren." Jewel, on the other hand, seems to take Addie's death the hardest. He was the one she loved the most, and he seems to return that affection, always upset with his family for how they handle his mom's death. But it's Vardaman's grief that is perhaps the most memorable of all, because how he processes his mother's death is not at all. He refuses to accept that the rotting corpse his family trots around in the coffin is his mother, because, as Vardaman states in the novel's most famous line, "My mother is a fish." Just before Addie died, Vardaman caught a fish and killed it. When Addie dies, at first, he holds the Dr. Peabody responsible, but eventually comes to hold himself responsible. He blames himself for his mother's death because his mother is a fish, the fish he killed. But even that doesn't satisfy Vardaman, and he comes to believe that his mother is still a fish, but not the one he killed. He believes his mother is a fish that escaped into the river the wagon carrying her fell into. Vardaman thinks she escaped through the holes he bored into the coffin, holes he bored for her to breathe through, thinking she was still alive. So Vardaman goes from blaming himself for his mom's death to convincing himself she's still alive and, ironically, swimming with the fishes. We never know for sure if Carl blames himself for never taking Ellie to Paradise Falls. The film cuts straight to Carl's denial. Vardaman's mom can't be dead because his mother is a fish. Ellie can still go to Paradise Falls because Ellie is a house. the house that Carl lived in with her.
Sheesh, can you believe this, Ellie?
Ellie? Hey Ellie, could I keep the bird? Uh-huh. She said for you to let me.
But I told him no. I told you no. N-O.
During her diatribe on the failings of language, Addie counts names too as being empty. I would think, ants. Why ants? Why are you ants? I would think about his name until after a while I could see the word as a shape, a vessel, and I would watch him liquefy and flow into it like cold molasses flowing out of the darkness into the vessel, until the jar stood full and motionless, a significant shape profoundly without life, like an empty door frame. And then I would think that I forgot the name of the jar. And when I would think Cash and Darl that way until their names would die and solidify into a shape and then fade away, I would say, all right, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they call them. Addie here separates the name from the person's body to show how the name failed to fit the persons they were attached to, with the names being like jars of cold molasses sitting motionless. Ellie's name seems to have undergone a similar process for Carl, only he did not render her name a shape profoundly without life. For Carl, removing the name from a person takes with it that character unique to people, life. Carl giving the house her name fills the house with her life and makes the house alive to him, as alive as she was. Imagining a person as a house is not as strange as it might seem. Certainly not as strange as imagining them as a fish. Houses are like people in many ways, especially the houses you call home with others, as Carl called his house with Ellie. Home is what Ellie was to Carl, so when Ellie was gone but the house remained, it only made sense for the house to fill the role Ellie left behind. Peabody, the doctor Vardaman initially blamed for his mother's death, sees a connection between people and houses. I can remember how, when I was young, I believed death to be a phenomenon of the body. Now I know it to be merely a function of the mind, and that of the ones who suffer the bereavement. The nihilists say it is the end, the fundamentalists the beginning, when in reality, it is no more than a single tenant or family moving out of a tenement or a town. Since Ellie's death, as Peabody posits, occurs mostly in the mind of Carl, it is quite easy for that mind to not accept that death, regardless of the body's absence. Carl simply refused to let the tenant he loved move out of the tenement they shared. Though you still have more to say about Carl and Ellie, you first have some things you like to say about Peabody's assertions. For one, you still hold to that fundamentalist view, as Peabody described it, as your dad certainly did. For two, when your dad left, it wasn't like you woke up one day and found he had moved out of the house overnight, like his lease expired and it was simply time for him to go. It wasn't like he hired a U-Haul and moved out all his things in one night. It was more like he had hired you all to help him move his things out, and you all did your part to move him out of the house, item by item, memory by memory. All the while the house itself was falling into ruin until it became, as Emily Dickinson described the house death took her to, a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground, until eventually the house was subsumed into the earth, as was your dad. Nothing was left of either in the end, except the memories you share of him. Addie Bundren's father said that the reason for living is getting ready to stay dead. I knew at last what he meant and that he could not have known what he meant himself, because a man cannot know anything about cleaning up the house afterward. And so I have cleaned my house. You and your mom were the ones to clean your dad's house that morning when you woke and found it had sunk in the ground entirely. You had been the ones in charge of the house's upkeep the last few months, along with the hospice nurses who came to help. The house you all lived in is still lived in by those who survived him, but the house he lived in passed with him. Carl, though, kept his house clean and alive to keep Ellie alive, to bring her to Paradise Falls, to make their dreams come true. Throughout the film, Ellie's absence signifies itself throughout the house, especially those places she once filled up with her life. Carl kept these places open, vacant, waiting for her to return. And maybe, if he kept his word, she would return. Then it'd be just like the picture he keeps tucked in their memory book. Just like in the promise he made to Ellie. Just like the dream they shared with one another. But when Carl gets there to Paradise Falls, he finds the house is still empty. Ellie isn't here. So he goes looking for her, in the one place he knows he can find her, in his mind, his memories memorialized in pictures. But he finds something there he never imagined to find. But before you can verbalize what that is, you need to step back and fill in a gap you left earlier. You explained how Carl transferred Ellie to the house in order to keep her and her dream of going to Paradise Falls alive. But you didn't explain how that dream of going to Paradise Falls was itself a transference of the loss of their child into this dream. Yes, the dream does predate the desire for kids, and Ellie never lost a child, but rather was never able to have one to begin with. But the film shows us a nursery waiting to be filled, and when Ellie is given the news, we see a full belly behind her. So when no child appears in their lives, this is not a mere emptiness, but an emptiness found in the loss of something that was there to them. When I was young, I believed death to be a function of the body. Now I know it to be merely a function of the mind, and that of the minds of the ones who suffer the bereavement. To Carl and Ellie, this is the death of a child, their child, and though Ellie may initially blame herself for the child's loss, she comes to keep the child alive to the dream of Paradise Falls, a dream that had been waning in their minds before, but now burns brighter than it ever had before. This was a dream they held as dear as a child. So yes, you can say the loss of Ellie is two losses, the loss of Ellie and the loss of her dream, but you'd do better to say the loss of Ellie is two losses, the loss of Ellie and the loss of her child, their child. So the dream meant to fill the hole left by their child itself waits to be filled by their adventure. So you return to Carl where you left him occupied in his chair, always sitting beside the chair unoccupied by Ellie. But now you see something sitting in that chair, a sash covered in badges not worn by anyone, a lack upon a lack. So, sitting beside this sight, Carl opens our adventure book. He looks upon the memories he remembers there, those of Ellie's early life when they had just met, then comes across a section of the book he thinks still waits to be filled by this adventure, a lack waiting to be filled by a shape. But, by happenstance, he turns the page and finds the lack already filled. The dream of Paradise Falls was itself filled by the adventure of Carl and Ellie's marriage, one final joyful transference finally fulfilled. But Ellie left one lack open for child, an opening for another adventure, in the shape of a child, Russell. Russell is the kid that's been chasing Carl around searching to fill his own lack, the lack of a badge on his sash. Yet, once again, this lack is standing in for another lack, the lack of a father in his life, his father who will come and fill that lack on his sash.
Well, why didn't you ask your dad how to build a tent?
I don't think he wants to talk about this stuff.
Why don't you try him sometime? Maybe he'll surprise you.
Well, he's away a lot. I don't see him much.
He's got to be home sometime.
Well, I called, but Phyllis told me I bug him too much.
Phyllis? You call your own mother by her first name?
Phyllis isn't my mom.
Oh.
But he promised he'd come to my Explorer ceremony to pin on my Assisting the Elderly badge. So he can show me about tents then, right?
In the end, Carl is the one to come and fill that lack. And he fills it with Ellie, pinning her name onto him where he once pinned it onto his house. This is an adoption ceremony. Carl and Ellie finally fill the hole their child left behind. But in order to give Ellie's name to Russell, he must first take it from the house. He must accept Ellie's death, which he does.
Sorry about your house, Mr. Fredrickson.
You know, it's just a house.
Finally filling her loss with the memory of their adventure together, he is finally able to accept her was by remembering the is he shared with her. And what does he do then? He cleans her house. Your dad was able to have those adventures before his passing. Where Carl had to look back on the adventures from Ellie's death, your dad was able to look forward to his adventures as he saw his death before its coming. I have been lucky enough to be reminded of this, that none of us are promised 1 second on this earth, and still have the opportunity to make what time I have count, and I will do that with every ounce of my body. You think your dad did make that time count, and he made it count with every ounce of his body, and that's how he could clean his house afterward. But while you were cleaning his house, you found a lot you weren't expecting, just like Carl did when he found their adventure book. Only where Carl flipped through the book and found memories he shared with Ellie, the memories you find were never ones he shared with you. One of these memories is his first of what would be many appointments at Duke, where he comments how, at each place I had to answer questions and had to tell the symptoms that I had to get me to this place. Each time that people were so intrigued by the symptoms. I'm really surprised that no one has ever had symptoms like me. I guess I always try to be different, haha. Then later that day when he had his biopsy, he wrote how, once the drill was ready, the assistant said he's going to start drilling. As soon as he said drill, my heart rate went up pretty significantly. I told him, "See what you did?" We laughed a second, then he started drilling. That was an interesting few minutes of listening to that drill grow. No words can describe that. Though you've never heard this story before, you read this and think that's classic Daddy. The humor in the face of grave circumstance is a trait he had even until the last weeks of his life. The story is new, but what it says about your dad isn't. Though words never probably fit the person they describe, we still use them as placeholders for those people in their absence. Like a jacket you toss over your friend's seat when they leave the theater to use the bathroom. You know the jacket would never fit your friend, but it signifies him to everyone else in the theater. So are these words to your dad. Words like husband, prankster, dad, Christian, calm, motorcyclist, joyful, talkative, musician, patient, mellophile, cancer survivor, humorous, cancer victim, engineer, jokester, and so many others. The story of her dad and his biopsy is really just the words cancer survivor and jokester stretched out into this little tale. But there are stories that can't fit themselves to any of these words, but instead are dressed in jackets fitting new words to your dad. In a post on his blog titled, "What's Wrong With Us?" your dad writes, "This morning I was on the way to work, thinking about so many things that are up in the air in my life right now, when I drove by a Jeep Cherokee sitting in the ditch on the other side of the road. I looked as I went by and it was a fresh accident, but no one was stopping. I drove down a little ways to the next driveway and watched in my rearview mirror as car after car passed, but no one stopped. I turned around and went back to the Jeep and got my umbrella and got out to see if anyone was in the car. Your dad finds a man slumped over in his car, but fortunately a nurse soon pulls up and calls 911 after taking the man's pulse and attempting to get a response from him. Eventually the man comes to, at which point your dad decides to pray for him. So I started to pray for him in a forced fashion, not a natural reaction as it should be. They got him out of the car and into the ambulance, and that was that. There are many things that have bothered me since I left. First, why have we gotten to the point where we don't help others unless it is convenient? It was pouring rain and people were hurrying to work, and everyone passed his car thinking, someone else will stop. This time I did stop, but how many times have I seen someone that needs someone and did not take a minute to help them? It makes me sick that even as a Christian I have this ability to not care inside of me. Since I have been diagnosed, I have tried to make a conscious effort to help others when I can. I still fail all the time at doing this, but each day I try to do better. Others need us, even if it is just to listen to them so they don't feel so alone. We should be there for each other, but we're not truly anyway. I am tired of being that way. You should be too. The words you glean from the story are compassion and frustration. You attach them to your dad like patches sewn on a jacket. You step back and see they've changed how you view the whole jacket. The way compassion compounds with Christian, the way both of those words are compounded by frustration, as it is being Christian that causes frustration with the lack of compassion. These are words and ideas you never viewed your dad through, but now they will be forever fixed to him in your mind when you picture that patchwork of words that is your dad to you now. There are some stories you have no words for. You never knew that in the early 90s while working at Circuit City, he had a customer attack him and knock him out, and when he came to, the man knocked him out again 2 more times. all because the man didn't agree with him that the battery in his car was defective. Your dad recounts the story as a list of the 4 worst things he experienced in his life. This is the first item on that list. Being diagnosed with brain cancer is the last. You never knew this was something that happened to your dad. It happened before you were born. It may have happened before he even met your mom. You'll have to ask her if he was working at Circuit City when they met. Yet it's something that stuck with him for 2 decades and stuck with him as one of the worst things that ever happened to him. This was written early in his diagnosis. The longer he lived with it, unfortunately, the more that would be added to that list. Just shy of a year with the cancer, he wrote this, and one last terrible word is patched to him. The last couple of days have been strange for me. This feeling I've gotten once or twice before has come back and is really indescribable. I wonder if this is what it feels like to have no hope, or if it is what it feels like to be apathetic. It is a feeling that makes you want to say, I am here, but why? It really weighed me down this morning going to work. It is like being in a large, pitch-black room by yourself. I wish I knew why I feel this way, or at least had a clue. It affects my wife and my 2 boys. They can tell when something is going on with me, even though my personality can change in an instant. I wish they didn't have to go through all of this with me. I wish they would have a normal life, instead of the roller coaster that we are on. I know God's timing is perfect. I wish, though, that He would show me why my life is headed in the direction it is sooner than when I get to that point. I pray, O Lord, that you guide me to do only your will in my life, no matter what it is. I still pray for that amazing God-given miracle in my life, no matter what the actual miracle is, as long as it points to you. You were 13 when your dad wrote this. You didn't have the imagination nor life experience to understand what your dad was going through then, to know that depression was a word that could even come close to your dad. But now you know something about being in a large pitch-black room by yourself, and to know you share this knowledge with your dad is its own terrible possession. But there is something else you share with your dad, and share with him still, that brought both of you joy. In a word, faith. This word was already counted amongst your dad before reading his blog, but it's a word that takes on new life once you read it, as you realize it's not just an empty word to your dad, just a shape to fill lack, but a word filled to the brim with joy and wonder. You can never see the full picture that God was painting in your dad's life, because you were so close to the subject of that picture. You can never stand back and appreciate the full picture. Until now, that is. And it is now that you realize the joy of the past tense. The tragedy is that it has passed. The tragedy is in knowing that your dad was. But the joy is in knowing that he is. That he had a life once. A life full of beauty and heartache. And a life that told such wonderful stories. Stories that can only be told now at their conclusion. Because every story can only be told when the writing of that story has stopped. And though that stopping means tragedy for you, it also means the starting of the telling. So how does the story go? What was his adventure? The Lord has given me a view of my life I did not like. I was a bench sitter for so long in sharing his son with others. He showed me that, and now I have taken every opportunity I can to share the love of Christ. As I have said so many times here, I hope that you learn from what he has done in my life to make sure you are where you're supposed to be in your walk with the Lord, and doing the things for him that really matter. We are not placed here to seek things for self for your entire life, then die, and that is it. There is so much more to life if you allow the Lord to open your eyes to it. He has given me a purpose through all of this, to encourage others that are facing the same thing I am, whether it is an encouraging conversation/email, prayer, or to just be there for someone. I wish I could have taped all of the expressions of love that were told to me today, from the old to even the very young. It seemed the story God has given me has struck a chord with many. Who would have thought that God would use an average guy like me for this? Praise God. And though this chapter of his life has ended, and it's very painful for you to be here without him, from the beginning Daddy was looking to the next chapter of his life. I cannot wait until I am standing in front of God with Jesus at his right hand, with all my being praising them. Well, he won't have to wait any longer. You will, though, for some time. And while you wait, all you'll be left with are these words like orphans searching for their parents. But one day those words will find a father. One day you'll find the perfect word, a word that was made flesh and dwelt among us, a word that was in the beginning, a word that was with God, a word that was God. And that word is Jesus. a word your dad sings every day now.
You'll never get bored of it.